Here we are in our Himalayan corner of the park. This is where we've got two of our conservation species. They're members of the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria breeding programs. We've got the red pandas and we've got the snowy owls. I'll start by telling you about the red pandas here. Red pandas are endangered in the wild. There's thought to be only between 2,000 and 10,000 of them left. That's because they are hunted for their fur and also for the pet trade, both of which are illegal. They're against the law according to CITES regulations, but unfortunately the law's not all that well enforced in a lot of regions. So what we do here is we support an organisation called Red Panda Network. They work in home range countries, particularly in Nepal, and what they do is they give people an alternative livelihood to poaching. So they pay people to be anti-poaching patrollers, for example, so paying people to get rid of snares and traps. They're also paying people to reforest areas that have previously been deforested. In about 20 years' time, the areas that are being planted now will have trees tall enough to support captively bred red pandas being released into the wild. So one of the reasons we have them in the zoo is to keep that genetic backstop, so that in the future, once it's safe to release them, maybe their great-great-grandkids could be released into the wild.
Hello there, my name is Dean Ward and I'm East Curator here at Shepreth Wildlife Park. Being a curator, I look after many different species of animal on my section. That includes carnivores and primates. The biggest carnivore we have on site is our Sumatran tiger. They do believe there's 300 to 400 left in the wild. Now here at Shepreth we have Ratna, who is 21, and her daughter Kelaboo, who is 16. Ratna has a cloudy left eye. She had a cataract removed from that eye about 7 years ago now. She has problems with her joints, but we give her daily medication to ease the pain in her joints, and she's on regular welfare checks. And they have a nice big enclosure. We hide the food in the enclosure. So by challenging her, I mean using enrichment inside the enclosure. Now that could mean hiding the food up a pole, on the platforms, in a paper bag or cardboard box. Also things like scent is always good for tigers as well, so olfactory smells is good enrichment for them. She's in there with her daughter Kelaboo. Kelaboo is 16 years old and Kelaboo is slightly bigger than mum. Now we don't breed here, we don't have breeding facilities for tigers, however we're still part of the breeding programme, and this breeding programme, EEP, European Endangered Breeding Programme, is an important thing. Where Ratna and Kelaboo came from is now a breeding facility. So we take on retired tigers and we make space elsewhere for tigers to breed. They do think there's probably estimated just over 4,000 tigers right across Asia left in the wild. 100 years ago, there would have been 100,000. So in the last 100 years, we've lost 96% of our wild tigers. And you can probably guess what's happened to them. A big reason is habitat loss.
Snowy owls, their conservation status is vulnerable, so that means their numbers are declining. They're not yet considered endangered, but if numbers continue to decline, they will be. Unfortunately, the problem for them is climate change. So they're a circumpolar bird, which means that they live mostly around the very northern parts of the northern hemisphere. They do come down into the tundra regions to hunt, but as the climate is changing, it's going to be harder and harder for them to find food. So that's the main problem for them. Another problem facing a lot of owl species is the effect of the Harry Potter films. Now, it was a great film. I enjoyed watching those films, but they had owls in there, and the owls that they had were trained, tamed owls. but this led to a huge demand for them as pets. A lot of them got hunted and taken out of the wild, and it had a real effect on the populations in the wild, but also on the welfare of the owls themselves. There's been places in Japan that have set up owl cafes. Now, owls are very nervous animals. They don't like to be held, they don't like to be handled, and so it's poor welfare for them to actually be considered to be pets. People who have them, who are professional falconers, tend to be quite hands-off. They fly them, but they don't pet them or stroke them.
One of our only native species is the Scottish wildcat, and we have 6 on site at the moment. We have mum and dad and their 4 offspring. We have 2 males born and 2 females. Now, Scottish wildcats, due to land use change, agriculture, they have been pushed up to a small part of Scotland called the Cairngorms. Now, we are part of a charity up at the Highland Zoo, saving wildcats. We breed here, then they release in the wild. Scottish wildcats are also hunted. Unfortunately, landowners persecute them, they trap them because they don't want them around their livestock. Wonderful cats. They do look like a domestic cat, and one question I always get asked is, have we just put some domestic cats in an enclosure? We haven't. They are Scottish wildcats, and we know that through their genetics. So you'd have to take blood samples or hair samples to tell that they are possibly about 90% Scottish wildcat. The reason they're 90% is many Scottish wildcat have bred with domestic cats, unfortunately. So we've lost that pure genetics. However, they have still the behaviours and the body shape of a Scottish wildcat, so we can still use them in the breeding programme. It's the first time we were successful in breeding this year. So we've got Canna, who's the mum, we've got Raymond, who's the dad, and we've got their 4 offspring. They will be moving on soon. So I am in consultation with someone called the stud bookkeeper. The stud bookkeeper is in charge of that EEP. It's not our decision, and when animals move between zoos and wildlife parks, no money changes hands whatsoever. With the Scottish wildcats, moving them on to maybe a semi-wild state or the wild will be beneficial for the breeding programme. So they're going to be moving on soon, hopefully. We'll be able to introduce Raymond and Canna back together, and then hopefully, fingers crossed, next year we'll breed again.
Shepreth is huge on conservation. It's definitely the priority that we have here. I think all of our endangered and critically endangered species that we have on site, the priority is to have them be useful for the breeding so we can increase their population and hopefully re-release them into the wild, their future generations. And yeah, the conservation here is massive. I think this is an awesome time to be involved in zoos, even just as a visitor or as someone that's working in them or anyone that's interested.
So I always say to our visitors or anyone I'm chatting to about animals, as human beings, we need to perceive them differently. And there's ways we can do that. The biggest tool in conservation nowadays is educating ourselves as human beings on what we can do, what we can change, and how we look at these animals. And certainly, if I overhear someone at a zoo pointing at an animal and saying, I'd like one as a pet, I always correct them. Unfortunately, there's many animals in the pet trade. Many animals are used in social media nowadays. So again, as human beings, we need to perceive animals differently. We want to get rid of phrases like, that's a cute animal. We want to think more about what does that animal do? Where does it fit in the food chain? And how can we get it back out in the wild where it belongs? So tigers, very important part of the food chain. Without animals at the top of the food chain, you'd have too many what's called herbivorous animals. They would take a lot of plant matter. As human beings, we need plants to survive. So it's important we have a balance in the food chain, and that balance starts from the top. So carnivores are an important part of keeping herbivorous animals populations down. So we need them, and with that drop in population of the tiger has a bigger impact. There is good news. So I said earlier, 96% of tigers have disappeared in the last 100 years, but for the first time in 100 years we have a tiger increase, and that's in northern parts of India. So the Bengal tiger, we have large reserves where humans can't go into, and surprise, surprise, we have a tiger population increase, and that is just because we've left them alone, we've walked away. Now, if we could use this sort of conservation across the planet, we would help many more animals. If we were able to leave large areas alone, the habitats would grow, the food chains would improve, and you'd get animals like tigers back in those locations. And that is what has happened in northern parts of India. We have a tiger increased population. In an ideal world, zoos wouldn't exist. And that would be an ideal world where habitats are correct outside, where populations are okay. But it's not an ideal world. And zoos play an important part nowadays in breeding. We have to justify why we have each species on site. Behind me is an animal called the golden lion tamarin. Without conservation in captivity, they would now be extinct. So captive groups of animals play an important part.